The sharp buzz of a hair clipper hummed through the small barbershop, mingling with the faint sound of jazz playing on an old radio in the corner. Marcus, a broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor and an easy smile, moved deftly around his client, shaping a perfect fade. The shop, with its sun-faded posters of classic haircuts and walls lined with community flyers, was a hub of life in the neighborhood. It was more than just a place for a trim, it was a safe space, a gathering point, a cornerstone of the block. But this afternoon, the usual warmth was overshadowed by an air of tension. Marcus had noticed them as soon as they walked in, a group of 4 men with swaggering steps and loud voices that carried more malice than charm. They weren't locals. Dressed in flashy clothes and sporting smirks that didn't reach their eyes, they used a certain energy Marcus recognized instantly. It was the kind of bravado that thrived on intimidation, and their presence sent a ripple through the otherwise relaxed atmosphere of the shop. Marcus greeted them with his usual politeness, but his instincts were already on high alert. He had seen this before, the way they eyed the place like they owned it, how they leaned against the counters without asking, their laughter cutting through the air like a blade. They didn't come for a haircut, that much was clear. One of them, a wiry guy with a tattoo snaking up his neck, sauntered up to Marcus's chair, his grin sharp as a razor. "Nice little setup you got here," he said, his tone just a shade too friendly. Marcus didn't flinch, didn't pause his work. "Thanks. Been building it up for years. Can I help you with something?" His voice was calm, steady. The guy leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a mock whisper. "Yeah, you can help by making sure you know who runs things around here now." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, drawing the attention of everyone in the shop. Marcus's client shifted uncomfortably in the chair, his eyes darting toward the exit. The other barbers glanced at each other, tension rippling through the room. "Is that right?" Marcus said evenly, his hands never faltering as he finished the cut. He grabbed a mirror, showing the client the back of his head. "Looks good?" The client nodded quickly, barely waiting for Marcus to brush off the stray hairs before bolting out of the chair and out the door. The other customers in the shop exchanged uneasy looks, some quietly slipping out themselves. The gang had effectively cleared the room, leaving Marcus and his barbers face to face with the intruders. The leader of the group chuckled, clearly pleased with himself. "Smart people know when to step aside. You seem smart. So why don't you make this easy on yourself?" Marcus finally set down his clippers and turned to face him fully, his expression unreadable. He wasn't a man who looked for trouble, but he also wasn't one to back down from it. He had built this shop from nothing, pouring his heart and soul into it, and he wasn't about to let anyone come in and tear that down. "You want to explain exactly what it is you're after?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but carrying an edge that hinted at the steel underneath. The leader smirked again, clearly enjoying himself. "It's simple. We're expanding our territory. You play nice, pay us a little something to keep things peaceful, and we make sure nothing bad happens to your pretty little shop." Marcus stared at him for a long moment, the weight of the room pressing in around them. He didn't respond right away, and the silence stretched thin, amplifying the sound of the clock ticking on the wall. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice low but firm. "You've made your point. Now let me make mine. This shop is mine. This community is mine. And I don't scare easy." The gang laughed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes. Something about Marcus's unwavering calm unsettled them, though they weren't about to admit it. "Big talk," the leader said, stepping closer, his grin faltering ever so slightly. "But words don't mean much around here. Let's see if you've got anything to back them up." Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a mountain of quiet confidence, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. And then, with a voice as steady as a heartbeat, he said, "You really don't want to find out." The room was electric, the tension almost unbearable. The gang didn't know it yet, but they were standing face to face with a man who had spent years in the ring, a man whose fists had earned him championship titles and respect in circles far beyond this neighborhood. They didn't know it yet, but they were about to learn. The leader of the group scoffed, trying to brush off the weight of Marcus's words, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He didn't know why, but something about the barber's calm presence gnawed at him. It wasn't fear exactly. Marcus didn't look scared. If anything, he looked like someone who had seen this kind of situation more times than he cared to count. The rest of the gang shifted uneasily behind their leader, their earlier bravado starting to waver. They hadn't expected resistance, especially not from a quiet, unassuming barber. To them, this was supposed to be just another easy score. Walk in, throw their weight around, and walk out with everyone too scared to question them. That was how it always went. But not this time. Marcus let the silence linger, his gaze steady, unyielding. Inside, he could feel the old instincts kicking in. It had been years since he'd been in the ring, but some things never left you. The ability to read a person's body language, to sense their intentions before they even moved, it was like second nature. And right now, everything about this gang told him they were more bark than bite. "You boys new around here?" Marcus finally asked, his tone still calm but carrying just enough of an edge to cut through the tension. The leader bristled, trying to reclaim some authority. "We're not boys, old man," he snapped. "And we don't answer questions. You answer to us." "Old man?" Marcus echoed, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "That's a new one. Haven't heard that since." "What, my last championship match?" The words hung in the air for a moment, confusing the gang. The leader's brow furrowed, clearly trying to figure out if Marcus was bluffing. "What are you talking about?" he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. Marcus didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his broad chest. The way he stood, the quiet confidence radiating off him, made the gang hesitate. There was something about him, something they couldn't quite put their finger on. "Look," Marcus said finally, his voice steady, "I get it. You think this is your territory now. You think you can come in here and throw your weight around, scare people into giving you what you want. But let me give you some free advice, you're not the first to try, and you won't be the last. This shop has been here long before you showed up, and it'll be here long after you're gone." The leader took a step closer, his jaw tightening. He didn't like being talked down to, especially not in front of his crew. "You've got a big mouth for someone who doesn't know who they're dealing with," he said, his voice low and threatening. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to convey that he wasn't intimidated. "Funny," he said, his tone almost casual. "I was about to say the same thing to you." One of the younger members of the gang, a wiry kid who looked like he couldn't be more than 18, shifted nervously. "Yo, maybe we should just..." "Shut up," the leader snapped, cutting him off. He wasn't about to let anyone see him back down. Not now, not ever. Marcus caught the exchange, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The dynamic of the group was clear. The leader was all bluster, holding on to control by a thread, while the others followed out of fear or misplaced loyalty. It was a pattern Marcus had seen countless times before, both in and out of the ring. "You know," Marcus said, his voice calm but with an undeniable weight behind it, "the thing about trying to intimidate people is that it only works if they're scared of you. And I don't scare easy." The leader's face twisted into a sneer, but before he could respond, Marcus took a slow step forward. He wasn't threatening, wasn't aggressive, but there was something in the way he moved that made the air feel heavier. "You've made your point," Marcus continued, his eyes never leaving the leader's. "But let me tell you something. This shop isn't just a business. It's a part of this community. People come here to feel safe, to talk, to connect. You think you can come in here and take that away? You're wrong." The leader opened his mouth to say something, but Marcus cut him off with a quiet, almost casual, "And if you're smart, you'll walk out of here right now and not look back." The gang members exchanged uneasy glances, the younger ones clearly uncomfortable. The leader, however, wasn't ready to let it go. He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "You think you're untouchable, huh? We'll see about that." Marcus didn't move, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his presence filling the room. And for the first time, the gang started to realize that maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated him. As the leader turned to leave, he spat out one last warning. "This isn't over." Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. He didn't respond, didn't say a word. He simply stood there, his calm presence unshaken. When the door finally closed behind them, the room was silent except for the faint buzz of the clippers still resting on the counter. Marcus let out a slow breath, his hands flexing at his sides. He knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But he also knew one thing for sure, he wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever. What the gang didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that Marcus had spent years fighting battles far tougher than this. In the ring, he had faced opponents twice his size, men who hit like freight trains and didn't stop until the bell rang. He had scars to prove it, both physical and emotional. And while he had left that life behind, trading the roar of the crowd for the quiet hum of a barbershop, the fire inside him had never gone out. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to take what was his. And it wouldn't be the last. But Marcus had learned a long time ago that true strength wasn't about how hard you could hit. It was about standing your ground, even when the odds were stacked against you. And as the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the shop, Marcus knew one thing for certain: the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The next few days passed in an uneasy calm. The shop was quieter than usual. Regulars came and went, but their conversations were hushed, their glances lingering on Marcus longer than normal. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood, and it didn't take long for everyone to hear about the confrontation. Most people admired Marcus for standing his ground, but others couldn't hide their concern. The gang wasn't known for letting things go, and everyone knew they would be back. Marcus carried on as if nothing had happened. He swept the floors, sharpened his tools, and greeted every customer with the same easy smile. But beneath the calm surface, his mind was working overtime. He had been in enough fights, both inside and outside the ring, to know the signs. This wasn't over. It was only a matter of time before they returned. That evening, as Marcus locked up the shop, he stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking out at the quiet street. The glow of streetlights cast long shadows, and the hum of distant traffic filled the air. He could feel the tension building, like the calm before a storm. He took a deep breath and turned to walk home, his steps steady and deliberate. At home, the reminders of his past were tucked away in a small corner of his modest apartment. A trophy case stood against the wall, filled with golden statues and championship belts that gleamed even in the dim light. Marcus rarely looked at them anymore. To him, they were part of a life he had left behind. But tonight, as he ran a hand over the worn leather of his favorite belt, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years: a quiet, simmering fire. The next morning, the shop was busy again, the usual rhythm returning as if nothing had happened. But Marcus's sharp eyes caught every detail. He noticed the unfamiliar car parked across the street, the way a man sitting on a nearby bench seemed more interested in the shop than his newspaper. He said nothing, but the tension in his shoulders told the story. Around midday, just as Marcus was finishing up a cut, the door swung open with a jarring clang. The gang was back. This time, there were more of them, 7 in total. They filled the small shop with their presence, their loud voices drowning out the usual hum of activity. The leader stepped forward, his smirk wider than before. "Told you we'd be back," he said, his voice dripping with false confidence. Marcus didn't look surprised. He simply turned to his client and said, "Give me a minute," before stepping out from behind the chair. The room grew quiet as everyone watched. The other barbers stopped what they were doing, their hands frozen mid-cut. Customers exchanged uneasy glances, some inching toward the door. "You boys have a short memory," Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. "I thought we already had this conversation." The leader chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Yeah, we did. But I think you need a little more convincing." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't say anything. He glanced around the room, his eyes meeting each of his barbers. They didn't say a word, but their expressions said enough. They trusted him. The leader took another step forward, his voice rising. "You're gonna pay up, old man. And you're gonna do it today. Or else." "Or else what?" Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. The leader faltered for just a second, but he recovered quickly, puffing out his chest. "Or else things get ugly." Marcus took a slow step forward, closing the distance between them. His calm demeanor never wavered, but there was a weight to his presence that made the gang take a collective step back. "I've seen ugly," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying more power than any shout. "And trust me, you don't want to go there." The leader hesitated, glancing back at his crew. For the first time, there was a crack in his confidence. But before he could say anything, one of the younger members of the gang, the wiry kid from before, stepped forward. "Yo, maybe we should just leave it," the kid said, his voice barely above a whisper. The leader spun around, his face twisted in anger. "What did I tell you about speaking out of turn?" he snapped, shoving the kid back. The movement was quick, but it was enough to set Marcus on edge. His fists clenched at his sides, and for a brief moment, the old fighter in him stirred. "Enough," Marcus said, his voice sharp and commanding. The leader turned back to him, his face red with frustration. "What, you think you're in charge now?" he spat. Marcus didn't answer. He simply stood there, his eyes locked on the leader, his presence filling the room. The standoff felt like it lasted an eternity, the air so thick with tension that it was hard to breathe. And then, with a sudden, almost imperceptible shift, the balance of power changed. The gang, once so full of bravado, now looked uncertain, their confidence shaken by the quiet strength of the man standing before them. The leader opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. Instead, he turned abruptly and stormed out of the shop, his crew following close behind. Marcus watched them go, his expression unreadable. He knew this wasn't the end. If anything, it was only the beginning. But for now, the shop was safe. As the door closed behind them, Marcus turned back to his barbers and customers, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Sorry about that," he said, picking up his clippers again. "Now, where were we?" But even as he resumed his work, the tension lingered in the air. The gang had left, but the storm was far from over. Marcus could feel it coming, and he knew he needed to be ready. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope. The shop had returned to its usual rhythm, but an unspoken tension lingered in the air. Marcus could feel it, though he never let it show. He kept his demeanor steady, his focus on his craft, but his instincts stayed sharp, always scanning for signs of trouble. The neighborhood had noticed the change too. People whispered as they passed the shop, their eyes darting nervously toward the door. Some of Marcus's regulars avoided coming in altogether, afraid of being caught in the middle of whatever might happen next. Marcus hated to see it. The shop was supposed to be a place of comfort, of community, and now it felt like a powder keg waiting to go off. It wasn't until Thursday evening, just as Marcus was locking up, that the storm finally broke. He had just turned the key in the door when he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. The street was quiet, the last rays of sunlight casting long shadows across the pavement. Marcus didn't turn around immediately. Instead, he took a slow breath, his grip tightening on the key. "You don't give up, do you?" he said, his voice calm but firm. The leader of the gang stepped out of the shadows, his smirk back in place. But this time, he wasn't alone. There were more of them now, at least 10 spreading out across the sidewalk like wolves closing in on their prey. "You think you're funny, don't you?" the leader said, his tone mocking. "All that talk about standing your ground, like you're some kind of hero. Let's see how tough you are now." Marcus turned slowly, his eyes scanning the group. They were trying hard to look intimidating, but he could see the cracks in their confidence. Some of them wouldn't even meet his gaze. "You brought more friends this time," Marcus said, his voice steady. "Does that make you feel stronger?" The leader bristled, his smirk faltering for a split second.
"You're gonna regret disrespecting us," he snapped. "We're taking this shop tonight." Marcus didn't flinch, didn't move. He simply stood there, his presence filling the space like a wall. "If you think I'm just going to hand it over, you're mistaken," he said quietly. The gang shifted uneasily, their bravado wavering under the weight of Marcus's calm defiance. But the leader wasn't about to back down. He stepped closer, his hand twitching toward his pocket. Before anything could happen, the sound of a car engine broke the tension. A black SUV rolled to a stop at the curb, its windows tinted so dark they reflected the streetlights. The gang froze, their bravado replaced by unease. The door opened, and a man stepped out, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a commanding presence. He was older, with silver streaks in his hair and a sharp, calculating gaze. He was dressed impeccably, his suit crisp and tailored, but there was something about him that screamed danger. The leader of the gang visibly tensed, his confidence crumbling in an instant. "Mr. Delaney," he stammered, his voice losing its edge. "What are you doing here?" Marcus's eyes narrowed as he studied the newcomer. He didn't know who this man was, but it was clear he held power over the gang. Mr. Delaney didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow look around, his sharp gaze sweeping over the scene. When his eyes landed on Marcus, he paused, his expression unreadable. "So," Delaney said finally, his voice smooth and controlled. "You're the man causing all this trouble." Marcus met his gaze without flinching. "Depends on your definition of trouble," he said evenly. Delaney let out a low chuckle, but there was no warmth in it. "I've heard a lot about you," he said. "A quiet barber who doesn't know when to back down. That's an interesting choice. And who are you?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but edged with curiosity. Delaney smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just say I'm someone who prefers order. And lately, it seems like things around here have been chaotic." The gang leader shifted nervously, clearly unsure of how to handle the situation. "We've got it under control, Mr. Delaney," he said quickly. Delaney's gaze snapped to him, and the leader shrank back under its intensity. "I'm not so sure about that," Delaney said coldly. "You've been making a mess of things, and now I have to clean it up." The gang looked at each other, their earlier confidence completely shattered. Marcus, meanwhile, was piecing things together. Delaney wasn't just some random stranger, he was the one pulling the strings, the real power behind the gang. And now he was here, standing face to face with Marcus, sizing him up like an opponent in the ring. "I respect a man who stands his ground," Delaney said, turning back to Marcus. "But there's a fine line between courage and foolishness. You've crossed it." Marcus held his ground, his expression unreadable. "If you're here to make threats, save your breath," he said. "I've heard them all before." Delaney's smile tightened. "This isn't a threat," he said. "It's a promise. You're in over your head, Mr. Barber. Walk away now, and I might let you keep what's left of your pride." Marcus didn't respond immediately. He could feel the weight of the moment, the tension crackling like a live wire. But he wasn't about to back down, not now, not ever. "I've faced tougher fights than this," Marcus said finally, his voice steady. "And I'm still standing." Delaney's expression darkened, his earlier amusement replaced by something colder, more dangerous. "We'll see about that," he said quietly. With that, he turned and got back into the SUV, leaving the gang standing there, their confidence in shreds. As the car drove away, the leader shot Marcus one last glare before motioning for his crew to follow. Marcus watched them go, his fists clenched at his sides. The stakes had just been raised, and he knew the fight was far from over. But if they thought he was going to give up, they were in for a surprise. The fire inside him burned brighter than ever, and he was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the air was almost suffocating as Marcus prepared himself for what he knew was coming. The neighborhood seemed quieter than usual, the streets eerily empty, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Marcus had spent the night replaying every word Mr. Delaney had said, every look exchanged.
He could tell Delaney was no stranger to control, to power. But he also sensed something else, a weakness hidden beneath that polished exterior. It was subtle, but it was there, and Marcus intended to find it. The following evening, the shop was almost empty when it happened. Marcus had just finished sweeping the floor when the door swung open. This time, it wasn't just the gang. Delaney himself walked in, flanked by two men who looked like they could crush bricks with their bare hands. Behind them, the gang lingered uncertainly, their earlier swagger nowhere to be seen. Delaney surveyed the shop with the calm precision of a predator. "You're still here," he said, his voice smooth and deliberate. "I was hoping you'd see reason." Marcus set the broom aside and straightened, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow across the room. "Reason doesn't mean rolling over for bullies," he said simply. Delaney smirked, but there was no humor in it. "It's not bullying," he said. "It's business. And you're standing in the way of mine." Marcus stepped forward, closing the gap between them. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with quiet intensity. "This shop isn't just a business. It's a safe place for this community. I won't let you take that away." Delaney's expression hardened. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said. "But guts won't stop what's coming." He gestured to his men, who stepped forward, their towering frames filling the small space. The room felt like it shrank as the tension reached its peak. Marcus didn't back down. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the muscle memory of years in the ring kicking in. He had trained for moments like this, fought men who thought they couldn't be beaten. And every time, he had proven them wrong. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," Marcus said, his voice low but commanding. One of Delaney's men laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "And why's that?" he said, stepping closer. Marcus didn't answer with words. Instead, he moved a blur of precision and power. In a split second, he delivered a sharp, calculated jab to the man's midsection, followed by a sweeping hook that sent him staggering back. The man crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain. The room exploded into chaos. The second man lunged at Marcus, but he was ready, sidestepping with the grace of a seasoned fighter. A quick uppercut sent the man reeling, and Marcus stepped back, his stance steady, his breathing controlled. Delaney's face twisted with anger, but he didn't move. He simply stood there, watching as Marcus dismantled the men he had brought to intimidate him. The gang members hesitated, their earlier bravado completely gone. It was clear they weren't used to seeing their so-called enforcers defeated so easily. One by one, they began to back away, their eyes darting nervously between Marcus and Delaney. Finally, Delaney raised a hand, signaling for them to stop. "Enough," he said, his voice cold and sharp. The room fell silent, save for the labored breathing of the men Marcus had taken down. Delaney stepped forward, his gaze locked on Marcus. For the first time, there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "You've made your point," Delaney said quietly. "But don't think this is over." Marcus held his ground, his expression unwavering. "It is over," he said. "This shop, this neighborhood, it's off limits. You take your business somewhere else." Delaney stared at him for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Finally, he gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else. "You're making a mistake," he said, his voice low. "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But it's mine to make." Delaney turned and walked out without another word, his men scrambling to follow. The gang lingered for a moment, their expressions a mix of fear and confusion, before slipping out the door one by one. As the door swung shut, the shop was left in silence. Marcus stood there, his chest rising and falling as the adrenaline coursed through him. He knew Delaney's type, he wouldn't give up easily. But for now, the shop was safe, and that was all that mattered. Just as Marcus was about to lock up for the night, he noticed something on the counter. A small, folded piece of paper had been left behind. He picked it up, his brow furrowing as he unfolded it. Inside was a single sentence, written in neat, precise handwriting: "You're not the only one with a past." Marcus stared at the note, his mind racing.
The words felt like a warning, a reminder that the fight wasn't over. But instead of fear, he felt something else, a renewed sense of determination. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, his jaw tightening. Whatever Delaney had planned, Marcus would be ready. He had faced bigger challenges before, and he wasn't about to let anyone take away what he had built. As he turned off the lights and stepped out into the night, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle over him. The fight was far from over, but he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. The days that followed were quieter, but Marcus knew better than to mistake quiet for peace. The note Delaney left lingered in his mind like an unfinished conversation. He spent his days focused on his work, greeting customers with the same warmth as always, but his thoughts kept returning to those words, "You're not the only one with a past." What did Delaney mean by that? Marcus had no doubt it was meant to unnerve him, to plant a seed of doubt. But instead, it fueled his resolve. His past was no secret, at least not to himself. Every scar, every victory, every mistake had all shaped the man he was. If Delaney thought bringing up old ghosts would weaken him, he was wrong. One evening, a week after the confrontation, Marcus was finishing up a late appointment when he noticed a familiar face outside the shop. It was one of the younger gang members, a wiry kid who couldn't have been older than 19. He wasn't trying to hide, if anything, he looked unsure of why he was there. Marcus stepped outside, folding his arms across his chest. "You lost?" he asked, his tone calm but firm. The kid shifted awkwardly, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "No. I just wanted to talk." Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't respond, waiting for the kid to explain himself. "I'm not here to cause trouble," the kid said quickly. I've been thinking about what you said. About not letting people like Delaney take over." He hesitated, glancing down at the ground before looking back up at Marcus. "You really mean it, don't you? Standing up for the neighborhood?" Marcus nodded. "This place matters," he said simply. "The people here matter. That's worth fighting for." The kid looked away, his jaw tightening. "I didn't have a choice, you know? When I joined up with them. Delaney finds guys like me, guys who don't have anywhere else to go. He makes it seem like he's giving us a chance. But it's not what it looks like. You either do what he says, or you pay for it." Marcus studied the kid, seeing the fear and uncertainty in his eyes. He knew that feeling all too well. "You always have a choice," Marcus said. "It's not always easy, but it's there." The kid nodded slowly, as if he was trying to convince himself. "I want out," he said quietly. "But I don't know how." Marcus considered this for a moment. Helping this kid could bring even more heat from Delaney, but it wasn't in Marcus's nature to turn his back on someone who wanted to do the right thing. "First step is walking away," Marcus said. "You don't owe Delaney anything. But if you're serious about getting out, you've got to be ready for what comes next. It won't be easy." The kid looked at Marcus, his expression earnest. "I'm ready," he said. "All right," Marcus said. "Then let's figure this out." Over the next few days, Marcus worked quietly behind the scenes, connecting the kid whose name, he learned, was Tyler with people in the community who could help. A local youth program, run by a retired teacher named Miss Carmen, welcomed Tyler with open arms. She had a knack for seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves. Word of Tyler's decision spread quickly, and it wasn't long before Delaney caught wind of it. Marcus expected retaliation, but when days passed without any sign of trouble, he began to wonder if Delaney had decided to cut his losses. That hope was shattered one night when Marcus returned home to find his front door slightly ajar. Every instinct told him to proceed carefully. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. Nothing seemed out of place at first glance, but the faint sound of footsteps upstairs told him he wasn't alone. Marcus moved quietly, his years of training kicking in. He reached the top of the stairs just in time to see a figure slipping out through an open window.
Marcus didn't give chase, instead, he focused on what had been left behind. His bedroom had been ransacked, drawers pulled open and contents scattered across the floor. On his bed was another note, written in the same precise handwriting as the first, "You're playing a dangerous game." Marcus folded the note and placed it in his pocket, his jaw tightening. This was Delaney's way of reminding him who held the power, or so he thought. But Marcus saw it differently. The fact that Delaney had resorted to scare tactics meant he was losing his grip. The final showdown came sooner than Marcus expected. It was a Saturday night, and the shop was closed when Marcus heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He turned to see Delaney standing outside, flanked by two new men. These ones looked even tougher than the last. Marcus stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "You don't give up, do you?" he said, his tone calm but firm. Delaney smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I gave you plenty of chances," he said. "But you just don't know when to quit." "And neither do you," Marcus replied. Delaney's smile faded. "You think you've won, don't you? Helping that kid, standing up to me, you think it changes anything? I've built an empire, and you're just one man." Marcus took a step closer, his gaze steady. "Empires fall," he said. "Especially when they're built on fear." For a moment, neither man moved. The tension crackled like a live wire. Then, without warning, one of Delaney's men lunged at Marcus. What followed was a blur of motion. Marcus moved with the precision of a fighter in his prime, deflecting blows and striking with calculated force. The fight was brutal but brief, and when it was over, Delaney was the only one left standing. He looked at Marcus, his expression a mix of anger and disbelief. "This isn't over," he said, his voice trembling. "Yes, it is," Marcus said. "You come near my shop, my home, or this neighborhood again, and you'll regret it." Delaney stared at him for a long moment before finally turning and walking away. Marcus watched him go, his body tense but his mind clear. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to heal. Tyler thrived under Miss Carmen's guidance, and other young men began seeking her out, inspired by his story. The shop was busier than ever, filled with the laughter and camaraderie that Marcus had worked so hard to protect. One day, as Marcus was sweeping up, he found himself reflecting on everything that had happened. Delaney's note had been right, he wasn't the only one with a past. But he had learned that it wasn't the past that defined him, it was the choices he made in the present. As the sun set over the neighborhood, Marcus stepped outside and looked down the street. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing he had done everything he could to stand up for what was right. The fight might not be over, but for now, the neighborhood was safe. And that was enough.